appreciate that talking about the sea at this particular moment in time is a difficult thing, because a lot of you might feel the sense of withdrawal from the sea. And so, yeah, so the sense of, what the sea might mean at a time when most people are sort of prevented from it. And I do think of that when I go to the sea these past few weeks, as we've been living in this new kind of climate in which the breath has been taken from us in many ways, from our lives and from people who are suffering. But then there's a sense of the breath that's been given back to us, and the clarity of the sky without the aeroplane contrails, the sense of the bird song, which is now extraordinary. I know that wherever you are, whether you're in London or Texel Island in the Netherlands or wherever, there's a sense of this kind of reconnection to nature. Someone tweeted me the other day and said, what if nature doesn't want to be reconnected? Which is interesting. And of course, the thing with the sea is, most specifically, it is the most immersive, obviously, by definition, but the most tactile relationship you have to the world. And that the leaving of the land for the sea is a kind of defiant gesture in a way. And for me, that's why I see it as I'm sure any of you know me, and I never learned to swim until I was 30. And I grew up in this city. I'm speaking to you from Southampton, in the house in which I grew up. Lived here pretty much all my life. I've lived in London and other places, but this has been a constant for me. And I'm about a mile or so away from the sea. And when I grew up in this house, it's only a tiny little house in the suburbs, the sea was an abiding presence. You can't see it from here, but you can hear it, and you can smell it, and you can feel it. It affects the way you orientate yourself. And as a child, as a fearful, timid child, which I was, it was this kind of ominous presence over that way, beyond the sort of suburban hedges and down through a windy lane to a shingly shore, to a semi-industrial seaway. It's not a pretty place. I mean, those of you who live here know that Southampton water, I mean, is it even the sea? Some people might question. It is definitely the sea. It's not what you expect of that kind of sense of a resort. Although historically, of course, it has that identity here. So for me, I was really the sound of the docks, the clanging and clanking, and the notion of these places which were like the sea, places of trepidation. You know, the docks, which was and still is a no man's land, as being a place which was a barrier between you and the sea, and it was a brutal, very patriarchal place, a place which was deliberately bulwarked against not only the sea from which it's actually receiving things, but from the humans which it's servicing. And I always, because in Southampton, you are, the whole identity of the town is centered around the sea, and yet is very much by the ports, by that edge of the land, separated from it. I mean, it's not like Brighton, it's not like, you know, any resort where it's easy to get to the sea. The whole thing about it is getting to the sea. It's actually, there's a lot about this town which is about preventing you from getting to the sea. And the sense of this place where, because when you leave the land, the oppression of the land becomes at its most intense. It's where the laws become the most extreme, where, you know, this barrier which is very difficult, and especially nowadays, to come through that barrier to justify your right to make landfall here. And the same way now, we can't leave the land. We can't actually leave this. We can't actually, most of us can't even leave the town we're living in. So that sense of restriction. So I am lucky, because in the dead of night, I creep out from this house on my bicycle and cycle through the dark. And I cycle down the wrong way down the street because I can. The only other living things I see are foxes, occasionally rabbits, gulls, which are roosting on the other far side of Southampton Water. And the most remarkable thing about, I suppose, about where we are now is that we steal these little moments, and I'm sure we are all doing this now. We are stealing moments for ourselves to re-establish our identity, because it's easy to lose your identity in a time when there's a threat to that, in a way, into what we are, what we do, you know, our jobs, our interests, our loves, our passions. Many of you, I haven't seen anyone for 6 weeks, you know, or some of my friends here, and I know many of you have been like that too. If you live on your own, you just don't see people. So for me, you know, I'm lucky because I can see one thing, which is the sea. And I was down there at 2 o'clock this morning, and it's pitch black. It's really black, and there's no traffic. You know, there's very few. I mean, occasionally there's a container ship coming in nowadays, but very few. There's no leisure traffic. Hythe ferry, the ferries have stopped. So the sea is returning to this kind of primeval place in which the flickering lights of the dock seem somehow pathetic. The kind of dominion which they held even only a couple of months ago has kind of been loosed, and the sea has re-established itself. And as I got in this morning and started moving through the water, the water's completely calm and black and still. It burst into stars because it's full of bioluminescence. I mean, it's just like nebula at your fingers, sparking away. I'd only ever really experienced that, I mean, maybe once or twice in Sri Lanka, in the Indian Ocean. I was lucky enough to go there. But it was as though there's this kind of, the sea was making some gesture about, you still belong. And actually, I think now, isn't it funny, because I was thinking yesterday about the whole thing about the bird song and how immersive it is to just go and stand in your garden or even in the street, poke your head out the window to hear bird song. There's something immersive about that. There's something all-encompassing about that. And being returned to that seems to me to be really precious. And I know there are many reasons why this is a terrible time, but it's also a time of change. And it made me think, and it made me thinking about, generally about the sea. And I've been writing again about the sea. I'm writing a new book, which is inevitably deeply involved with the sea. And I've been thinking away the sea, like my favorite animal, and I don't suppose it comes as any surprise to any of you that that animal is generically the whale, that the sea changes according to what we demand of it, that it actually almost physically changes. It almost physically changes with my body, as I put my body in it, almost like homeopathically, this sense that do I leave a trace of me behind? And I certainly do, because I leave a trace of my bodily oils behind. But does the sea remember me when I go back? Like whales, when you go back to Wales, they do remember you. How has the sea changed? And specifically, I think of Southampton Water, which is, it's an in-between sort of waterway, because it isn't really a sea, but it's certainly not a river. And it's a conduit of history down which so many things have flowed, you know, invasion, culture, viruses, the Black Death was said to have first entered England through Southampton Waterway, this kind of inseminal conduit into the land. And I was thinking about where I swim is in the shadow of a medieval abbey, a ruined medieval abbey. I mean, it's on the outskirts of Southampton, it's sort of scrubby edgeland, really, but it is a medieval abbey. And I recently discovered that the monks there felt it their duty to put a light every night in the topmost tower of the abbey as a kind of beacon to mariners. Well, what a wonderful thing, what a wonderful notion. And I think about how in the medieval times monks would meditate in the water. There's this legend that St. Cuthbert, wonderful, the first person to introduce legislation to protect animals. He introduced a legislation to protect the eider ducks of the Farne Islands. He was said to go naked in the sea at night and spend all night in the sea praying. And when he came out, there was a pair of otters waiting to come and dry his feet for him. Unfortunately, I don't have any spare otters down at the shore this morning when I came out. But a sense of what the sea must have meant at that moment in the medieval period, when whales were dragons at the edge of the earth, undiagnosed, unspecified creatures of fear and trembling, voracious, horned, hairy, tusked beasts, which would swallow you up. And they were coming up Southampton Water at that time. There's medieval remains of whale bones being used for chopping blocks, for combs. There's actually a medieval ordinance stating that no bits of whale may be landed on West Quay in Southampton. Any Sotonians here know West Quay now is this huge shopping mall. But in the medieval period, you weren't allowed to land whale there, possibly because it's so stinky. Anyone who's ever come across bits of dead whale will know how pervasively stinky they are. The smell stays on you for days if you come into contact with them. And again, that sense of, how would those animals have been regarded by monks? There are accounts in medieval period again of whales and dolphins coming up Southampton Water, that you would see dolphins sporting in this waterway. And it made me think of how, since the lockdown, dolphins have reappeared in the Venetian canals. And how the medieval world would have created an image of the whale, which was completely to do with the notion of the fable. And as you know, a fable is a story which must involve an animal. It revolves around an animal. It's a comparison between, it's an allegory between ourselves and other species. And how in the medieval period, the distinction between humans and animals is a very different one, because animals were expressions of faith and spirituality. They all held a specific power. The narwhal tusk was regarded as an antidote to poison. Of course, it was being touted around Europe as the tusk of a real unicorn. Queen Elizabeth was given one by Sir Martin Frobisher, the great Arctic explorer, or exploiter maybe would be a better word. He gave her one which was said to be worth £10,000, for which she could have bought a new castle. In the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands, they have narwhal tusks as candlesticks, and narwhal tusks which would be kept on sideboards of banqueting houses. Should the Duke of Burgundy, for instance, become poisoned, he'd rub off a bit of narwhal tusk and he'd be cured of his poison by that. So a very different way of looking at animals in the sea, because the sea was so completely other. It was unencompassable. You couldn't travel it very easily, which makes the Vikings' probable expeditions as far as New England, modern New England, so remarkable. That sense of what the sea, you would not, there's very few accounts of people learning to swim at that point. The sense of it being a recreational place, completely just wouldn't have existed really. It was a meditative place, a scary place. It could take you places, but you wouldn't really trust it. And in Southampton, specifically, again, I think it's very interesting how that, as a place, is a kind of case history, that sense of the sea changes so remarkably in the 18th century when it finally becomes a resort. It's like Brighton, like Bournemouth. Well, Bournemouth isn't created until the mid-19th century, but other places which discovered the therapeutic benefits of the sea. The sense that placing your body in it was not only not terrible, it was actually positively beneficial. That I found a wonderful account from the 18th century how you must immerse your entire body except your head. If you immersed your head, you were opening yourselves up to all sorts of terrible things. It's this very interesting notion that you had to keep your brain separate, that there might be some weird, strange brain freeze that happened. But so when you go round places specifically in the South Coast, which is I know best, places like Torquay, which at the beginning of the 19th century had become this extraordinary mechanism by which you could experience the sea. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the great wonderful poet who's inspired by the romantic poetry of Keats, of Shelley and Byron, all of whom were completely orientated towards the sea as a sublime place, this new kind of sea, a sublime experience of the sea. Elizabeth Barrett Browning goes to Torquay and is installed because she's suffering from this strange malady, which is a kind of psychic reaction against the 19th century. She feels her body under attack. We still don't know what was wrong with her. But she finds the sea this great release. And she stays next to this hotel where the whole of the cellar is open to the sea. So at high tide, the cellar of the hotel floods, so the guests can come down without leaving the building. They can immerse themselves in the therapeutic, health-giving properties of the water. And at the same time, you've got Jane Austen, J.M.W. Turner, John Constable, Thomas Gray, Horace Walpole visiting Southampton. And Horace Walpole talks about the Southampton Sea glittering with vessels. It's a really extraordinarily different way of looking at the sea as an aesthetic experience, as a kind of portal, a sense of transcendence, something seen for its own beauty, beauty for its own sake, because it's a profound experience. In the same way as they would look at the landscape through clawed glasses, you know, these darkened glasses, almost as a way of framing the sea, that you framed it within this kind of romantic frame, and it became this something else, a kind of portal, something which was, I mean, specifically like Shelley, who was obsessed with the sea, refused to learn to swim, and used to jump off a boat in the middle of the river or the water, sea, and like just let himself sink down. And Byron had to dive in and pull him out again. Shelley would complain, he said, why did you do that? In another moment, I'd have been on another planet. Well, he would have already been on another planet, I expect. But it was, so this sense of what the sea became in the Romantic period is really the legacy that we live with. And the idea that you go to somewhere like Torquay and there are entire concrete stairways built down into the water to take you into the water. You have the same in Plymouth, down at the Hoe there, these kind of amphitheatres which were created to open to the sea. You would never, health and safety would never allow that now. You would never allow, you know, that actually structures taking you into the sea. Now there are so many like warnings during times of storms, you know, the storms we had earlier this year, and, you know, the sense of the sea as being this roaring monster that would drag you in like an octopus in 2,000 leagues under the sea, 20,000 leagues under the sea, you know, this sense of the danger of the sea is another barrier. It's this psychological barrier, a cultural barrier, between ourselves and the sea, which doesn't exist in the 18th and 19th century. It's a very different relationship. Still that sense of terror, of course, because that was the whole idea, especially of the Gothic, which, as you know, down here in Southampton Water, Netley Abbey, which Jane Austen visited, might have been the model for Northanger Abbey. You know, it was said in Thomas Love Peacock's Gothic sort of skit, Nightmare Abbey. He talks about this abbey hanging over the sea, ruinous with owls, and that sense of delicious fear. I think that's why I go in the sea at night. I think it's a sort of a delicious fear. It's challenging your fears. And the other sea, the third sea that I think about now is the modernist sea, which is the sea in which is my personal legacy, because I'm swimming in the sea which came about specifically in Southampton Water because it became an industrial place, a place where the largest refinery in Europe was built at that time, Fawley Refinery, this great sprawling megalopolis of gantries and chimneys and silos, sucking out the crude oil that's brought here from across the sea, which is then processed through this refinery and then pumped through the country intravenously to flood the kind of arteries and veins of Britain with this fuel. And the sense of this new usage of the sea is entirely industrialized, something which is being polluted, obviously, not much awareness of that in the mid-20th century. And what that did to animals like whales and birds. And in Southampton Water, we have Brent geese. I was just looking out this morning, they pretty much left now. They migrate back to Siberia. But the idea that these animals still, and have been coming here for centuries, probably before human beings, all the way from Siberia, these Brent geese with their blackened heads called Brent, it's the Norse word for burnt, these stalwart Arctic animals coming back to this strange suburban shore to live. And when you see them, skeins of them flying up the estuary, when they come back in October, it's a wonderful sight. It's such a contrast against the spiky refinery towers. And the sense that these animals have learned to live with us in the same way as whales have done. The oyster catchers that you see feeding at the shore, they were down there this morning pecking away. The tide was low mid-morning, and lots of oyster catchers feeding there. And cut into the wattle and daub wall of the Tudor house in Southampton, which is very close to God's House Tower, where we virtually speak from now. I'm not actually there, but where Hannah works, is a place where that's on the wall has actually oyster catchers carved into the wall as graffiti, medieval images of those birds, which predate the building, obviously. So the sense of the culture of those animals really interests me. I mean, I can talk to you about what I think about the water and about this waterway, but I wonder what story they would tell us. And so in the modern period, when you have another cultural relationship to the sea, which is dominated by war, because the 19th century gives way to the 20th century, which was a brutal period in many ways, and is a brutal period for the natural world, because of the way its resources were used, especially for instance, whales. Probably about 175,000 whales died during the First World War to provide oil to be rubbed into Wilfred Owen's soldiers' feet to protect them against trench foot. Whale gelatin went to make nitroglycerin for bombs. They went to make munitions. So the way the sea then becomes this terrible place, which is full of fear, but real fear now, these mechanical whales, the U-boats and submarines, the sense of how that new identity of the sea becomes quite a violent place. And then you have the writings of people like Virginia Woolf, or James Joyce, or Wilfred Owen, or Sylvia Plath, or Samuel Beckett, all of whom write really interestingly about the sea. There's an amazing passage in Samuel Beckett's story Malloy, in which Malloy is drawn towards the sea because that's the only place that's going to stop him, really. And by the sea, he takes pebbles out of his pocket and sucks them one by one and puts them back in his pocket. This strange, like, ritual relationship to the sea that it becomes sensual. It's evoked by Virginia Woolf's stream of consciousness. All her books take you to the water, to the lighthouse, the waves. They always have this sense of the flow, the ebb and flow of the sea, which is a continual narrative. It's really interesting that Virginia Woolf read Moby Dick at least 3 times. She had 2 copies of the book. She called Vita Sackville West her lover. She called her my porpoise. And she explained for future generations, such as you and I, that all her books could be explained by the vision of a fin. So it's those ways in which I think about the sea changing according to what we want it to be, like animals, because animals have to change according to what we want of them. And I think about what the sea means now, because it's been abused by us. It's become a kind of carbon sink. It's absorbed the carbon we've pumped into the atmosphere, that same carbon releasing process that is embodied by the refinery. It becomes something which is a new arena of change, that we know that in the future we're going to have to get most of our food, or a lot of our food, from the sea, where we end up having to use it in a different way. That it's the plastic pollution, the acidification of the sea, all these aspects which make us start to think of it as being another kind of fearful place, another kind of contaminated place, contaminated by us again. But actually, I see a tremendous sense of hope about the sea, that its abiding presence, its momentum, the way it renews itself every day, and twice a day, it's entirely new. It's never the same, but it's always there. Yeah, I'm going to stop talking now then and see if anyone has any comments. I've been blathering on. I think I started doing when I was, because I spent a lot of time in Cape Cod. And my landlady's house there, she was this very eccentric, wonderful artist called Pat de Groot. And she had this really intense relationship with the sea. She used to go out on a kayak. Even in her 80s, she died, she was 88, she died 2 years ago, sadly. And but she would go out and kayak all hours. But she would go out and feed killer whales with flounders, dead flounder. She would draw them. But her house was built actually over the sea. In fact, I didn't realize I'd been staying there for 10 years. I actually realized that really high spring tide sea actually went underneath the house. It was a wooden house. And my room there was like an attic, and a wooden stair directly down to a deck on the sea. And at night, at full moon, especially at full moon. And the funny thing is that the Cape Cod province town where I go has the same tidal range and same tidal periods as us. And if you live in Southampton and if you live in Provincetown, the high spring tides always fall at midnight. So a big full moon would shine through my attic window, and it sort of woke me up. And I just realised, well, the water's out. Then I know, why not swim? So that's when I started swimming at night time, and the sense of the not being seen, so you really are subsumed then, that you're not, because when I swim down here, there's always someone waiting for you when you come out and say, is it cold? I'm trying to think of different ways of answering that, but there's no one to say that in the middle of the night. And I don't mean that in a misanthropic way, but just it makes the experience really more intense, because you hear everything, because you can't see things, you feel things more intensely, you hear things more intensely, you hear animals. I was there last week in the dark, very early, and I had this big splash behind me. I have no idea what it was. It was obviously animal. It wasn't a bird. So I didn't know what it was, so I couldn't see it. So it's quite scary. It can be quite scary, but yeah. So it's, I suppose it's just a sense of me trying to challenge my own, not challenge. It's not a big sort of macho thing. It's just like, this thing's there. It's no different at 12 o'clock at night than it is at 12 o'clock in the daytime. People keep saying to me, so why? Yeah, it's really dangerous swimming in the dark. Well, why? I mean, I don't understand why. I could drown at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Quite as easily as I would at 2 o'clock in the morning. It'd be very difficult to save me if I was out far enough. It's so. Yeah, yeah, but it is magical as well. I mean, when you have the stars and the moon, it's really beautiful.
Hi, my name is Mia. I'm the acting programme lead at A Space Arts. I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and if you can spare a few pennies for GHT, please follow the link in the description below to donate to our PayPal account. The money you donate will help support the organisation through this difficult time and allow us to continue developing content like this to keep us all entertained at home. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking here and hitting subscribe, and you can watch more quality content from GHT by clicking here. Thanks again everybody, and stay safe.